Hey everyone, it is Josh D'Alessandro coming back with another episode of the Optimal You. And this is a post-holiday Optimal You podcast episode, so hopefully everybody is kind of recovered from some of those decisions that we made on Thanksgiving. I am still very, very much thankful for the small food coma that I was in. Fantasy football went pretty well too. There were some gifts, there was a little bit of drinking. Pretty much did everything that I wanted to do, but also all of those things that I said I should do that I was hoping maybe some of you also gave a chance with. So that was my list of holiday items to kind of stick to. So getting to the gym beforehand, making sure that your nutrition is on point before you got to whatever party or family event that you were going to, and then making sure the next day was right back on track as opposed to slamming down one of those Thanksgiving sandwiches, which again, I saw my family and friends making them, and I was just kind of enamored at how high the stacks were getting. It almost became impressive, and then I realized I don't want them eating that, but everybody can make their own decisions. I was perfectly fine with my egg whites, avocado, some bacon. It's definitely a lighter carb day after Thanksgiving. I didn't even get the chance to work out just because I was so busy when I got back. So once again, that's kind of introducing the balance side of things that we're going to refer to all the time in this podcast. Honestly, if you hear the word balance and it starts to drive you crazy, I would not be surprised because it drives me nuts to say it. So I'll try to find some alternative words for that. And going into this episode today, what we're actually going to do is we're going to talk about fats. Okay, so with fats, it's one of those macronutrients that once again has kind of gotten a bad reputation. And we were discussing before with carbohydrates that they too are getting a bad reputation. So the reason I think that these macronutrients get a bad reputation is because there's a misconception about how beneficial they are in our current society in terms of the nutrition they provide us, okay? So what I want to do here is kind of dive into what fats actually are in terms of the food sources, of course. And then we're going to talk about what they are in the body. We're going to talk about cholesterol, which I know is a huge topic these days, and there's also a lot of information out there, some relevant and recent new information that I think a lot of people need to hear moving forward. And then we'll also talk about fats and exercise performance. So a little anecdote, as someone who was morbidly obese when I was a child, I dealt a lot with bullying, and I dealt a lot with situations that I felt incredibly uncomfortable with, because the word fat is tossed around quite a bit. And I always joke now that if somebody is fat, they're 100% adipose tissue, which is physically impossible. So I don't like the word to begin with. I don't like its connotation. I don't even like the fact that it exists in a negative mindset, in a negative way. Because, growing up, I obviously did what I had to do to get by. And I still performed in sports. I still did great in school, and I stayed true to myself. But it was really, really tough sometimes to get through those days with consistently being made fun of for my weight. And it was something I felt I couldn't really control. And a lot of the times, if I did feel like controlling it, the bullying and the name calling made it harder for me to want to do so. Okay, so going forward, let's do our best to be nice to people and maybe not use the word fat, and maybe use more positive terminology to get people motivated to change that part of themselves, okay? So personal anecdote over, moving into some of the information that's more particular to fat as a macronutrient. So it is one of the 3 macronutrients, okay? And a little side note here, in my book that I wrote, which hopefully gets published soon, I don't know, it's a lot harder to publish a book than I thought. I don't know, George R.R. Martin made it look really easy with Game of Thrones, but Winds of Winter is still not out, and it's been 8 years. Come on, George. You're like 71 years old. I don't know how much more time you got left. But in my book, I discuss how fats definitely became the wrongly accused victim in this entire nutrition change that was undergoing in the early 2000s, let's say that. I'm assuming everybody remembers the reduced fat, the fat-free day and age. And the reason for that was because of that significant increase in corn or high fructose corn syrup and additional sugars in our food. In order to increase the amount of sugar that was being distributed, they were putting it into most of these foods, removing healthy fat and labeling them as reduced fat and fat-free. Okay, so I'm going to mention that a lot of the times because that is where the misconception on fat began. And there also used to be a period of time where saturated fat was said to cause cardiovascular disease. And in my world of exercise science, there is no such thing as direct causation. There are way too many variables that can contribute to something like cardiovascular disease. But as we go forward, I'm actually going to talk even more about the fact that saturated fat has very little impact on whether you develop cardiovascular disease. And I need you to bear with me here because that probably goes in contrast to what other people have said to you, possibly even your cardiologist. But the most modern research is very definitive on the fact that there are far more relevant variables that contribute to it. So listen up, listen with an open mind, and we'll get through this together. So in terms of what fats actually are, when we take fats into the body, they are in broken down form as free fatty acids. Okay, that's how they exist in the blood. Okay, and then they are synthesized and stored in our body as triglycerides. And triglycerides usually get a bad reputation, obviously, but they really are just the storage form of fat when you talk about physiology. Okay, and fats are incredibly good for us. When we take in a healthy amount of fat, we increase our absorption of fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamin A and D, which a lot of people are low in this country. We increase our immune health. So, for example, a lot of people that get sick have severely low body composition, and that's because they cannot function immunologically to their optimal levels. Okay. It also regulates temperature control, which is absolutely essential with changing weather conditions. And then it also is the precursor for a lot of really important hormones in the body, cholesterol specifically. And that's the precursor for testosterone. I'm sure you've heard of this before where, for example, a female with very, very low body fat percentage started having no menstrual cycle. And that's because there's such low body fat and so low cholesterol that the hormone levels and the circadian rhythm got severely impacted. And this could lead to the inability to have children, overall infertility. So there's a lot of negative side effects to not taking in enough healthy fats in your nutrition plan. Okay, so obviously I talked about a couple of terms there. One of them is cholesterol. Okay, so we're going to talk about cholesterol here because once again, there are some definitive distinctions between the type of cholesterol, but there's also some misconceptions. So the misconceptions are that all cholesterol is bad for you. That's not true. There's actually a type of cholesterol in our body known as HDL, which is high density lipoproteins. These are actually pretty tough to get through nutrition. Most of the time we increase our HDL profile through exercise, caloric control, and also a reduction in the bad cholesterol, that being the LDL, which stands for low density lipoprotein, and then the very low density lipoprotein, VLDL. So the higher those last two numbers are, the more likely you are to have blockage. The higher the HDL, the greater the clearance of the LDL and the VLDL is. However, when it comes to increasing HDL and reducing LDL, VLDL, a lot of it doesn't come specifically from cutting out foods with fat and cholesterol. A lot of the research actually shows there's very, very little link there, and we're going to talk about the reason for that. Okay, there's actually, when you talk about genetics, for example, genetics definitely creates a predisposition for elevated cholesterol, but when you think about it, if you have a genetic predisposition, using it as a crutch and saying, well, I'm going to chalk it up to my genetics is the biggest mistake you can make, because I've had patients that come in that are labeled as high cholesterol but have really high HDL, low LDL, and low triglycerides, which when you look at a cholesterol panel or profile is not high cholesterol. Okay, so you decide what to do with your genetics. If you want them to rule your life, then that's fine. That's your decision. But you also shouldn't. If it's coming from me, my genetics aren't spectacular, and I've increased my metabolic response, I've increased training, my muscle mass. Nothing is going to hold me back that I can't control myself, and it should be the same for you. Okay, so now that we understand the benefits of fat, the differences between these cholesterol types, right? So high density lipoproteins are a lot it's almost described as fluffy, like they're really easy to move through the bloodstream, and it helps with the removal of the low density lipoproteins. And the VLDL, those are much denser, much harder to move from the body, could eventually cause blockage and atherosclerosis, or a heart disease. Okay, so as those things build up over time, they could definitely lead to a blockage and cardiovascular issues. However, when I say over time, this is over decades of really, really, really bad decision making. Okay, so let's move into a new topic. And like I said, we'll come back to what it means when people say that dietary cholesterol and fat intake don't impact cardiovascular disease as much as we say. All right. So next is the saturated versus unsaturated fat debate. So to kind of toss it and keep it simple, saturated fat is solid at room temperature. So butter or coconut oil or lard even is an example of saturated fat. Then mono and polyunsaturated fat, which is considered to be healthier for you, is your almonds, it's going to be your oils, it's going to be your avocados, things that can be liquid at room temperature. Okay. And once again, if you look at the sources of saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fat, a lot of them are actually whole foods that the body can process. However, there's another fat that thankfully has decreased substantially over the years, which is called trans fat, which is this evil Frankenstein type fat that is like rock solid at room temperature, basically. So a big piece of advice, granted, like I said, cholesterol intake, fat intake isn't the determination of cardiovascular disease. However, with trans fat, there is absolutely no place in your nutrition plan for it, zero. You can find it in a lot of peanut butters that are like Jif or whatever. It'll say hydrogenated vegetable oil, which means it's literally extracted and made solidified by humans. So naturally, once again, man gets their hand on something and suddenly it becomes worse. Can we stop it, please? So in the game of unsaturated and saturated fats, that's not the fixation. A lot of research has actually come out that says saturated fat intake is not directly correlated to cardiovascular disease. Once again, I'm hinting at it. I promise we will get there as to what is the cause for cardiovascular disease and other diseases that we have to worry about with regards to nutrition, okay? So when it comes to what causes that, a lot of the research is showing now that if you eat a ton of calories, right, regardless of what they are, and you do not exercise, that creates what is known as a caloric surplus, okay? Anybody can overgo their caloric surplus if they don't exercise enough and if they eat too much. Even people that exercise can go into their caloric surplus too, because maybe they started eating more because their appetite's higher, which is great because your metabolism is up, but you still have to have an idea of what your caloric threshold is. So the way I see it is there's a cup in front of you and you're filling the cup up. You fill it with water, you fill it with oil, you fill it with just a bunch of different liquids, right? There's no specific pattern to it. And it gets to the top and it stops. Picture that as your normal caloric intake, right? Now let's say you exercise for 30 minutes. So that goes down a little bit. So maybe 2/3 of the cup is now full. Then you fill the cup up again to the top and continue to pour. And now the cup is overflowing. And when the cup overflows, that is the caloric surplus that I'm talking about. And the caloric surplus leads to a flowing of these stored fuel sources into our blood. Okay, so triglycerides, for example. Triglycerides are supposed to be stored form of fat. When we take in too many calories and there's a presence of these triglycerides, they will stay there. It's the same thing as sugar in the blood, right? Blood sugar is going to remain elevated if the caloric intake is too high, because that means that our stores, whether it's our liver, our muscles, our cardiac cells, are full to capacity. So when they're full to capacity, everything else just remains in the blood. Of course, your body attempts to remove it, but consistent overconsumption of calories with decreased exercise is going to lead to the increased presence of these particles in the blood over time. Okay, so if you're perpetually overeating and under-exercising for 30, 40 years, it's not because of that 1 or 2 steaks that you had. It's because every day you were eating 400 calories more than your body needed, which meant your cells couldn't hold it anymore, and therefore it entered the bloodstream. Okay, so that's what the research is saying. Even if you have a predisposition to high cholesterol, if you manage your calories and exercise and build your muscle mass, you will have healthy cholesterol levels. But if you chalk it up to genetics and continue to overeat, whether it's Ben & Jerry's or even if it's healthy foods, that is the surprising thing here too, is that there can be an elevation in cholesterol when you overconsume healthy calories. All right, so in further episodes, we are going to talk about how to determine your caloric needs. And there are so many variables that contribute. So in that episode, you're going to have to bear with me and actually perform some individual activities for yourself to figure out what that number is. But we'll talk about that later. So what I want to profess about fats is it's not the foods themselves that is going to be causing these problems. It is more the caloric density of most of our nutrition plans. And that leads into my next topic of discussion with fats. So as I was discussing in our earlier podcasts, protein and carbs have 4 calories or 4 kilocalories per gram, whereas fats have 9. So it's more than twice as much, right? So one of the biggest things that I hear from my patients, for example, that say I'm not losing weight, I'll ask them, I'm like, what are you snacking on? What are you eating? And they're like, oh, well, I eat tons of almonds. I'm like, okay, hold on a second. What does tons of almonds mean? And they'll tell me they had like 6 or 7 servings of almonds, which is upwards of, it varies obviously, but that's like an extra 1,000 calories that they're taking in. Now, is it considered to be a healthy fat because it's lower in saturated fat, higher in fiber? Absolutely. But once again, we have to go back to this concept of caloric restriction based on what you need. If you want to stay the same weight, for example, you should take in a certain number of calories. If you want to lose some weight, you should take in a certain number of calories. So by eating a lot of healthy fats, it's fine until you reach that point where you've overconsumed your calories, okay? It's very easy to do on a high-fat diet, for example, keto. But the reason why most people don't go over their calories on keto is because carbs have been taken out and protein has been limited. If you're taking on a well-balanced nutrition plan, you have to know how much fat you should be taking in versus carbs and protein. Because if you know how many carbs and protein you're supposed to be taking, but you overdo it with fat, now you're in that caloric surplus we're talking about that causes a flood of these particles into the bloodstream. Okay, so we always need to be paying attention to the numbers, the calories. Now, that does not mean I'm saying go and eat pizza every single day because it fits your macros, right? Like that's a big thing right now, the if it fits your macros. And scientifically speaking, based on everything I've said and what the research says, it works. It makes sense. However, when I eat avocado with grilled chicken, sauteed kale, and sweet potato, I feel a heck of a lot better than I do after slamming down 3 slices of pizza. Believe it or not, those meals are pretty close in calories when I really log it up, but it's the micronutrient, the fiber intake, and all of the other additional vitamins that I get from the healthier meal that makes me feel better and also allows me to perform exercise at the highest level possible. Okay, so that's where the quality of the nutrition to me comes into play. Now, there's definitely research out there that shows you should not be eating these foods ever, whether it's like the cream-based sauces and everything like that. And I agree, because it just slows you down. But I don't think it's because it will immediately cause cardiovascular disease. You can't eat a steak and be at risk for cardiovascular disease. What you can do is keep eating super high calorie foods, not exercise for decades, and then develop blockage over time. So if you're going to sit there and hone in on this one moment, become so fixated that you miss the big picture, that's the biggest mistake that you can make. All right. So once again, in summary of all of this, and I went through that pretty quickly, so please respond with questions. I would love to actually talk before we close up on exercise performance with fats. So I'm going to keep this one simple because the research is pretty simple on this topic as well. Basically, what we're looking at now is that fats do not really have a pre-exercise performance need or a post-exercise performance need. With fats before a workout, specifically HIIT training and weight training, we're utilizing carbohydrates most of the time. At the lower intensities, we might be utilizing fat, but we have a lot of fat stored. We have many, many different sources of triglycerides to pull to form free fatty acids. So it's not like with carbs, for example, we can deplete carbs within a training session. You will not deplete all of your fat in a training session. That is like nearly physically impossible. So there's no necessity to, fill the tank with fats the same way it is with carbs. And then post-training, eating fats does not keep you anabolic the same way eating healthy carbs and the same way getting your protein levels do. Because muscle protein breaks down and you can actually really, really deplete protein quite a bit. Same thing with carbs. Once again, though, those fat levels are very high. Okay, so when it comes to exercise performance, I pretty much stay away from fats an hour and a half to 2 hours before and an hour and a half to 2 hours after my workouts. And again, please reach out to me about the specifics of your training plan. But even still, I don't see a need for fats before and after training. Outside of it, in terms of snacks, additions to meals as a way to increase your fiber, fat-soluble vitamins, absolutely. But in terms of a performance macronutrient, it's probably the least impactful. Actually, it is the least impactful of the three. So don't stress so much about the fat intake in terms of your exercise performance. Stress about the fats in terms of getting those high quality sources in and making sure that it fits your calorie profile. If you eat 3,000 calories worth of avocado and your total caloric necessity is 2,400, you will gain weight, you will leach triglycerides into the blood, and you will also maintain levels of blood sugar in the blood because the cells cannot retain anymore. So you have to be aware of your individual needs. That's what this entire page is all about. So if you aren't fully aware of your individual needs, please reach out to me, okay? And I will structure it with you. I will talk you through it. It's not as hard as it seems. You just have to be able to open up to yourself about what you're doing, what's real, and cast out the noise that says fats are bad, the noise that says keto is the way to go, the noise that says carbs are going to kill you. There's a lot of noise out there. So put on your noise-canceling headphones that's hopefully playing this podcast and just ask me questions and enjoy the process, enjoy the journey. Have an amazing rest of your week. Take all of this and apply it as much as you can, please. That's the purpose of this entire thing, is to make sure that you can apply it and enjoy the rest of your days going forward as well and as healthy as you possibly can. So get after it, have a good one, and I will see you later.